I'll just say a little bit about RCEN and a little bit about the SDG caucus. So the RCEN is actually a national environmental organization. We have affiliates in different provinces. Ontario, Manitoba come to mind especially, and of course in the Atlantic Canada. Aside from the affiliate organizations, so the affiliate organizations have a lot of provincial, smaller organizations that belong to those. And so we work in tandem with those organizations. But we are a very open collection or a group. We have a number of caucuses working on different subjects, from things like toxics to biodiversity, to environmental planning and environmental approvals. And of course, we have the SDG caucus. The SDG caucus has been around actually officially for only about a year. And in that time, we've managed to do quite a lot of things. We've brought folks from local here in Kelowna who are working on different sustainable development projects, teams of students from the schools in the SDG Challenge. We've also had a legal brief written on a pro bono basis for us by a law student from the University of Ottawa, talking about where Canada stands on the SDGs and what kind of legal grounding they have. And you can get this on the RCEN website if you'd like to read more about that. There's also a branch of really keen folks who are interested in education and the SDGs. And we've been involved in a number of events. Like particularly, we had an event which was part of Together Ensemble last year on teaching with the SDGs. And I do want to say before we leave today, just so if you are interested, if you're an educator or interested in education side, we have SDG Week coming up in March, which is hosted around UBC, the University of British Columbia. We also wrote to the Federal Ministry of Environment last year regarding the Sustainable Development Strategy. You can also see our letter on the RCEN website. In general, we have 4 main areas of action that we've developed. One of them is knowledge. And so it's great to see folks here that are sharing their knowledge and their interest in environmental questions. So creating a stock of resources and developing those network connections that we can all benefit from. The second one is activism. And I think that RCEN has a long history of working with government, but also in terms of pushing government on environmental legislation. And I think that's something that's going to become important in the next few months. We also operate at multi-levels. So I know that there's a big interest in cities and localization in the SDG community in Canada, but cities are often hamstringed by the fact that their budget comes from the province, and the provinces have to relate to the federal government, and federal governments get involved in city decisions as well. So we like to think that we operate at multi-levels. And lastly, one of our focuses is also just creating dialogue. So the SDG Speaker Series is kind of our opportunity to bring people together and to dialogue on important issues that they've identified. So with that in mind, after our presentation, we'll have an opportunity to ask questions. I would ask you to just hold your questions after Michelle Lewis has had a chance to say a few words about natural asset management. And, when it comes to the SDGs, I really think that the presentation today is best viewed through SDG 15. So SDG 15 is life on land, and it refers to things like protecting, restoring, and promoting sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably managing forests, combating desertification, halting and reversing land degradation, and halting biodiversity loss. Now, obviously, SDG 15 is huge. And in fact, when you look at the way in which all of these things are interconnected, you see that the underlying values underneath the SDGs recognize those interconnections. So the land that we live on, the way we farm, the way we produce food, the kinds of things we do in settlements, the kinds of things we do in planning and policy, all of these things are closely connected to biodiversity, to water, to even to social justice issues. And so I think that one of the things that I find so interesting about natural asset management is that it's trying to shift our valuation. So how do we value nature, right? How do we think about the nature in relation to human needs, human interests, and not to reduce it to just something that we use and throw away? And so I feel like sometimes, especially SDG 15 can push us towards thinking about moving away from the idea that nature is just available and used and using it up, right? And to enable conservation, but it's directed towards our own political and social systems. And so it's not about changing the land, but it's about changing our view of the role and value of land. And so that's why I think it's so important to have Michelle Lewis here with us. And she is the natural asset manager for the town of Gibsons. And those of you who might be new to this idea, this has created a national organization, a national movement on natural asset management. And it has created a whole series of academic studies and dialogues and discussions in a variety of different fora about how we can revalue land and how we can think about city policy and planning in a new way, in a different way. Because the SDGs have to be transformative, if nothing else, right? So I'm so pleased to introduce Michelle, and I'm going to turn it over to her now to share with us her ideas on the town of Gibsons and natural asset management.
Thanks, Rosalind. Okay, let me see how I can share my screen. Share screen. Share. Okay, can you see that with my notes and everything?
Yes.
Okay, so let's go. Now, can you see it without my notes?
We're seeing presentation view.
Okay.
So the notes view.
Let's try this differently. Cass, we did talk about practicing beforehand, didn't we? Okay.
I've noticed that before with presentation view, it should just show on the screen the presentation, but it shows your notes. I don't know why it does.
Okay. Let's try this again. I wonder if I can just do it as, let's go back. I had it all worked out this morning. That was before I was sharing screen. Just all right, did that work?
Yep.
That looks better. We see town of Gibsons.
How do I go back? Oh, there we go. There, how's that? But now I don't have my notes.
Yep.
Let me see, I can probably find it here. Okay, are we seeing the screen? Perfect, okay. So first, I just wanted to acknowledge that I am located on the traditional unceded territory of the Squamish Nation. I'm calling in today from Checkwelp, which is currently known as Gibsons, which is a very important area for the Squamish Nation. It's the birthplace of the Squamish Nation. This talk is I mean, it's going to be a lot different than I had expected because it's such a small group, which is great. Then I don't really have to follow my notes, so we can just talk through this. But what I wanted to talk about was natural asset management as community resilience strategy. So as I think it was in my bio, maybe not, Gibson's has started this journey back in 2013 with our current CAO and Chief Resiliency Officer, Emmanuel Machado, who is supposed to be doing this talk today. And I came into this role in July of 2020. My role was created to be a kind of a pilot study, and it was a 6-month term just to see if the role and the position was viable and needed. And it became abundantly clear fairly early on that yes, it was needed. And so it's been almost 3 years in this role, and it's been a pretty crazy journey. Things have really gained momentum as far as in Canada for natural asset management, and it's pretty exciting to be at the forefront of that. So for those of you that don't know, Gibson's is on the west coast of British Columbia. This region, as shown on the left, is known as Atkatsum or Howe Sound. And the red outline specifically shows what has been deemed the UNESCO, the biosphere, the 19th biosphere within Canada just recently. And it encompasses all of Squamish territory, or sorry, Squamish territory is larger than this area, but this goes through Vancouver, it goes up to Squamish, Whistler, and down to Gibson's on the west side. Okay, so the Eco Asset Strategy was the first document that Gibson's produced to do with natural asset management. In 2014, Council deemed that nature was to be our most valuable asset. And at that point, we became the first municipality in North America to pass a municipal asset management policy that recognized natural assets, defined them as an asset class, and then created specific obligations to operate, maintain, and replace these assets alongside capital engineered assets. So in doing so, and I think this was in the bio, that it moved natural assets to the periphery, from the periphery of decision-making to the core of our operations. Something I might get into a little bit later as far as financial planning is that the operating body of Pacific or Public Sector Accounting Board of Canada, they don't allow municipalities to include natural assets in their financial statements. So what we did back in 2014, I believe it was, we included natural assets as a note at the end of our financial statement. We couldn't put it as an asset, a formal asset class, but we included it as a note, which kind of every year since then, we continually add it, and that note becomes bigger and longer and more important. Back in 2015, the Gibson's Committee of the Whole endorsed our official eco asset strategy. And it was a document that kind of was a trailblazing approach to place nature at the core of our municipal infrastructure system. And then in 2016, Emmanuel Machado, the CAO and CRO, became a founding member of the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative. So this is a not-for-profit that assists municipalities across Canada in performing natural asset management and looking at natural asset inventories and looking at identifying, valuing, and accounting for these natural assets in financial planning, asset management programs. And where am I? Okay, so what are natural assets and why do we even care about them? Rosalind kind of mentioned it in your introduction there about that it's wrapping our heads around what we're actually talking about. And when the conversation about valuation of natural assets has been contentious, because there are folks that believe that we shouldn't be trying to place a value on nature, but to be clear, that's not the intention of natural asset valuation. It's putting value on the ecosystem services or any of the civil services that natural assets perform for a municipality. So for example, the Gibsons Aquifer, which is our sole source of drinking water in Gibsons, it provides obviously storage and filtration. And it also, because of the nature of our aquifer, it delivers drinking water that is so pure that it meets health standards without any chemical treatment. So we don't have to chlorinate. The town has won awards for our water, and it's something that kind of started our journey into natural asset management, and because it's so crucial to the health of the whole community. We also have our creeks and wetlands. They help manage stormwater, and obviously they convey stormwater from up the mountain down out to the ocean, and the foreshore as well. It protects our beaches, it forms a natural seawall, performs wave attenuation, protection from storm surges, which I'll kind of get into a little bit later through one of the projects we have done recently. And then of course, don't forget the co-benefits. This is something that is kind of unique to natural assets, where a culvert isn't going to provide additional benefits other than conveying stormwater, but a creek would, with habitat and biodiversity and many, many different co-benefits. Okay, so the graphic on the right just shows the interjurisdictional governance and ownership issues that need to be balanced. So there are many stakeholders and right holders in this graphic that would show, say, a drop of water that falls on the top of Mount Elphinstone, which is our local mountain here. And by the time it gets through to the ocean, there's multiple levels of jurisdiction that are responsible for these areas. So when Gibsons recognized natural assets within their asset management policy, it recognized new types of assets, including natural assets, biomimicry. And biomimicry, we mean like building a stormwater management pond that acts like a wetland, but it has been built, engineered assets as well. It looks at restoration of natural assets, such as creeks, foreshore. It creates teams and budgets for maintenance and operations. So with things like drainage within the town of Gibsons, it touches on natural assets as far as creeks and ditches and stormwater ponds, and then also alongside those built structures. So it creates a team that has to work across the public works, parks, engineering departments. All of these need to be involved, which is great because it stops that silo mentality. It also it's transitioning from managing a single asset into managing ecosystem. And when we talk about watershed scale planning, it's because we have natural assets that obviously don't care about the boundaries that we put in place. We're talking about ecological boundaries, not just jurisdictional boundaries. So White Tower Park was the original biomimicry system that we have within the town of Gibsons. That it's a enhanced wetland pond. It filters and treats our stormwater from development before entering the creek system. And this pond system highlighted a combined asset management effort. So we had annual operational cost, including park-related maintenance and cost for stormwater management as far as dredging ponds. And so that created a system in which we had to look at these natural systems through the lens of our as an infrastructure asset. So I had mentioned earlier PSAB, the Public Sector Accounting Board, and how we created this note at the bottom of our financial planning. Since then, we have lobbied to the federal government and to the PSAB that we can include natural assets within our financial reporting, and this is gaining traction. We had quite a few signatories on this letter that was sent out to PSAB, so hopefully, but things don't move very quickly within PSAB. So one of the concerns for me is when, because what's considered, PSAB considers tangible capital assets, and they don't consider natural assets as a tangible capital asset. And so when we apply for grants to do projects, the language has to be really clear that, that if we are wanting to do a creek restoration project, we would have to talk about tangible capital assets and then kind of slip in natural assets. So for example, I just applied for a grant to do a massive creek restoration, and I had to talk about culvert replacement and culvert upsizing because those are tangible capital assets. And then also talk about how we would do restoration plantings, and we would use natural asset management alongside the built infrastructure. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about the projects that I've been doing since starting in this role, and what I wanted to mention too is that as far as the projects themselves being multi-jurisdictional, what has been really great is in working on these projects, it's been bringing together lots of different groups within Gibson. So we have the Sunshine Coast Streamkeepers, I have the Squamish Nation that have interest in these projects. Healthy Watersheds Initiative was a grant funder for one of our projects. And then it forces me to have conversations too outside of our local area and talk more regionally and talk to the province as well. So this started the aquifer mapping update, or sorry, the aquifer mapping study was performed in 2013. And it was, like I had mentioned, it was a pretty crucial piece of our community to understand our Gibson's aquifer, which is the sole source of drinking water. So this image here comes from a model that we have that shows the different layers of the aquifer, and through that it helps us understand what potential risks would be in different areas of Gibson. So out of that comes, we have what we call restrictive drilling zones in Gibson. So if somebody's wanting to develop, and we know that there's different areas of Gibson's where the confining unit of the aquifer, called the aquitard, is thinner, then we have more stringent policy around that. And then in Upper Gibson's, which is this area up here, we know that there's less risk of us puncturing the aquifer through drilling, but there's more risk of contamination just because of the nature of the infiltration capacity of the soils in that region. So we updated the mapping study in 2021, late 2021, it was completed. And so it's just pulling more data from local drilling and putting that into the model. And then also looking at climate change scenarios. So looking at decreased precipitation or increased precipitation, looking at sea level rise because the aquifer goes underneath the ocean. And so we have to be concerned about saltwater intrusion. And so it just looked at all these different scenarios, drought, and then projecting out increased per capita use and seeing how the aquifer would respond. The next project that I was working on, we called the Coastal Resilience Project, or the Managing Natural Assets for Coastal Resilience. We actually just won an award for this for Clean 50 projects, I guess, for BC. And this project I worked on with the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative. They funded it, or they found funding for us. And we worked with SDG Technologies, which is a amazing kind of boutique adaptive management systems ecologists firm. And what we wanted to understand was what natural assets could we enhance or use or implement that would mitigate any effects of sea level rise or coastal storms, and reduce impacts of erosion and flooding along the foreshore, because Gibson's is primarily, we've got quite a large foreshore. And so so the infrastructure options that we looked at were things like submerged structures, eelgrass protection and enhancement, beach nourishment, meaning like shoring up with like additional logs and anchoring them, or looking at increased grain size. So like having bigger boulders, having riprap, and also shoreline plantings. So adding additional dune grass, and also increasing the run up into, so instead of having a steep shoreline, flattening it out so that when the waves do come in, that they're not running up quite as, or hitting quite as hard. So one thing that we found from this project is that though natural asset alternatives weren't effective for those really high large storm events, but they did have a bit of an erosion benefit and also flooding benefit, but it wasn't significant. But what it did show was that for those smaller storms, it definitely helped. But the interesting thing with that is, so one of the outcomes was that communities in this area need to start looking at planned retreat and managed retreat. And so moving infrastructure, critical infrastructure away from the shoreline, because right now we have a sanitary line that runs fairly close there, and just looking at long-term planning. How am I doing for time, Rosalind?
Well, we allowed for quite a range of time, so
Okay.
I think you're fine from my perspective.
Okay, great. Okay, so the Source to Sea project is it's a watershed scale project that we're working on with Municipal Natural Assets Initiatives and SDG Technologies again. And so this is to get a full picture of the condition of the natural assets within the town of Gibson. So you can see on the screen, this outlined area here is what we call the aquifer extent, or the aquifer recharge area. So our aquifer sits down here under Gibson's itself, and Gibson's is this tiny little area here. This is all outside of our jurisdiction. But what this shows, pardon me, this is a dashboard that we created that looks at forests, riparian areas, wetlands, creeks, foreshore, and then through the project, we are looking at the condition of the assets, and then we're identifying risks associated with those assets that could potentially impact those assets. And then from that, we'll be looking at how best to manage those risks and create policies to mitigate any of those risks. This project has been going on since 2020, I believe, or 2019. It's kind of it's a long one, and it has, from this project, we've kind of had a bunch of spin-off projects, which is great because it was a dynamic project that made us understand that there was more data that we needed, and it brought up a lot of questions, and more questions than answers, I'd say. So when this is completed, it's going to be a roadmap for other municipalities to undertake this condition assessment risk analysis for natural assets at a watershed scale. So hopefully we will wrap up this project. I think it's slated to wrap up at the end of August in this year. So like I said, what came from something that was highlighted through the Source to Sea was that we didn't have enough hydrometric data. So that's creek data that looks at flow, looks at levels, looks at temperatures of the creeks. And from that, like I mentioned earlier, the partnerships that were created and built out from this were significant. So we started working with the Sunshine Coast Stream Keepers because they have interest in the creek, and then it's kind of snowballing. So, like for example, I had somebody from a community association group come to my office yesterday, and he's asking me to lobby our neighboring jurisdictions to do more work on protection of these areas and looking at further hydrological studies. So like I had mentioned, this is Gibson's here, just this tiny little area. These are all, you can see the creek systems. And so these are catchment areas for each creek system. This blue here, this is the aquifer extent. So this is it sitting underneath our town. So as you can see, the majority of the recharge area is outside of town boundaries, but it's in our best interest, especially for protection of the aquifer, to make sure that these areas are managed and protected. So we are building relationships with the province and building relationships with the Squamish Nation and with the Sunshine Coast Regional District to try to partner and collaborate on these projects, because I can't do it all. I mean, we only have limited budget, and also it's outside of my jurisdiction, so it's not really my place to start putting in hydrometric stations all up and down these creeks. So, okay, this is one of the last things I wanted to mention. Sorry, excuse me. Is talking about limitations to natural asset management. And in 2021 and 2022, I did my master's at UBC in urban forestry leadership, and I chose to do my final report on implementation of natural asset management in this region and looking at the barriers and finding a path forward. So I wasn't the first to look at these barriers. The University of Waterloo has done some work on that as well, but I wanted it to be specific to this region because it was going to help me in my work. And then also looking at how these barriers are compounding and how each one kind of exacerbates the next. And the interesting thing is, because I work with MNAI, Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, so closely, I hadn't told them that I was doing this study or this research, and then they came out to me and said, oh, we're looking at barriers in BC for natural asset management implementation, and we're creating this document, we'd like your input. And I was like, we're both doing this. Okay, that's great. But the great thing is that theirs is going to be more widespread. It was just released and uploaded a couple of days ago, and also that they aligned. So thank God for that. So through this study, I interviewed folks in local governments in this at Catsum Howe Sound region, and looked at if the barriers that I had assumed were in place were actually taking place within their municipality, and then also what they thought that the next steps should be and how we can move this forward. So highlighted here is complexity and uncertainty, and that's things like it's new. It's an emerging discipline. People don't understand it. I shouldn't say people don't understand it. It's complex and it's hard to understand unless you're working on it day to day. There's again, knowledge, so lack of things like definition, even a definition of natural assets, and then governance is the biggest one, in my opinion. Going back to that other slide with the jurisdictional layers within a watershed, is quite complex, and then building out that collaboration across all these sectors and all these jurisdictions. And then, of course, it all comes down to funding and capacity, staff capacity, financial capacity. And anyway, I won't get too into it, but I just wanted to highlight that this is kind of, these are barriers that keep coming up, and it's across all municipalities that have been interviewed on this, and it's something that we need to work on it. And so my opinion is that we should be looking at natural asset management as a climate strategy, a climate resilience strategy, because there is so much funding available from the federal government, the provincial government for climate work. And so, but like I said earlier, I can't get grant funding for natural asset management, but I can get grant funding for climate adaptation and mitigation. So that's the plan. Next steps for Gibson's. So we're actively working on this community resilience strategy. So this is kind of been a project that the CAO has began years ago. And it's just looking at all of the things, looking at the assessment of where we're at as far as resiliency. And when I talk about resiliency, it's community resiliency as in like health and well-being and economic and biodiversity and all the things that we talk about in SDGs, and where we are at and how we propose to, putting actions in place so that we're actually achieving these goals. It's interesting because there's a lot of frameworks out there, like there's the Clean BC roadmap that was recently released. And so, the federal government has one as well, and looking at their actions to get these, to get towards more resilient communities. But it's all kind of like, I'm trying to understand if they speak to each other and how best to build out a framework for our own organization. So that's something that we're working on, like I said, actively right now. The other one is a predictive model for the watershed. This is quite fascinating to me. It's because I've been, for the last 2.5 years, 3 years, been trying to understand how all of these complex systems interact with each other. So when we talk about watershed scale, we know that when water comes from the top of the mountain, it will run through all of these areas. And so what happens if you change something upstream? So we're kind of looking at this in the Source to Sea project as far as like, what happens if we clear cut a large portion in the upper watershed? What's going to happen downstream? And so to be able to model that, there's stormwater models that are out there, but they're not going to answer all of the questions that we have. So I'm working with this complex systems modeler right now, and he and I are building this this model looking at like health outcomes of changing things within a system, an interconnected system. So it's pretty groundbreaking. It's really exciting. We're hoping that it works, but it's going to be like a interactive model where you can literally like add more trees and then run the model, or like increase the temperature, the mean annual temperature by 5-10 degrees, whatever, and then run the model and see how your assets react, and not just the natural assets, but also the built, your roads, your culverts. And yeah, so hopefully by the end of the year, we're going to have a dummy model. And yeah, but it's just like trying to understand and answer those questions is like how we know these things are all connected, and how do they interact with each other when we make a change. And so that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And are you comfortable with having your contact information there on the recording so that folks who might watch the recording later could get in touch with you?
Yeah, that's great.
Awesome. Wow, so much food for thought. And it's so incredible the way that Gibson's is breaking ground on this. And as you were speaking, of course, because I think this way, I started to bring in some of the other SDGs, and SDG 11, obviously, sustainable local communities, but also because Gibson's the unique location on the coastline and life below water, right? So it's not just the coastline, but it's also the ecosystem of the ocean. How is that going to be affected as well? So
yeah. So that's like when I'm looking at a creek system, I feel like there's so many lenses that you can look at that. So for me, I have to think about it as far as funding capacity. So
Yeah.
right now I'm looking at flow and level, because I want to understand, when we have these peak, like these high precipitation events, what's that going to do for stormwater management? Because
Exactly.
I have money for that, right? But there's also erosion. So there's geotechnical hazards. Then there's also biodiversity. There's salmon habitat. And then when we have these peak events, it's shooting sediment out into our estuaries, which can smother our eelgrass beds. So again, like going back to these partnerships, because I'm working with our Marine Education Center here, and they're looking at doing a study on one of our creeks because of the impacts of road runoff. Right? We don't have issues with salt like some places in the interior would have, or other places in Canada, because we don't use much salt on our roads in the winter. But we still have, there's still stuff coming off of the roads into our creeks. Hopefully our creeks are healthy enough that they're filtering them before that water goes out into the ocean. But we don't know that without collecting more data. So it's, yeah. And like you said, with the SDGs, we can't just, I went to a workshop recently with the Howe Sound Biosphere Region Initiative, and we were talking about SDGs because that's kind of the basis of a lot of the work that they're doing. And they said, what's your, we were in this working group at our table, and which SDG is most relevant to you? Like, which one do you, and I was like, how do you even answer that? Like, they're all connected. They're all, and I remember thinking there was 10 of us at the table, and I chose the life on land because that's where the majority of my work takes place. And I thought, oh, everybody's going to say the same one because obviously, and everyone's were different. And it was such an interesting exercise to see how other people connect with SDGs and with this work. So yeah.
Thank you. So it's 10 o'clock, but we do have some time for questions. And so I'll just open it up to anybody. I think we lost Fenora.
I have a question that I could ask. So you talked a little bit about integrating natural asset management into our financial planning. And you mentioned that we don't really consider natural assets as of right now as tangible capital assets. So I was just wondering, like, if you could speak a little bit more as to like how we might encourage a little bit of a shift in perspective. I know it's always tough to bring new ideas to the table, but maybe you might have some ideas based on what you guys have been working on so far.
Yeah, I think, like I mentioned earlier, there is momentum. And it is actually it is on the table for PSAB. They are talking about it. But I work with the director of planning, or sorry, the director of finance here quite closely. And she's saying, yes, they're aware of it. People are talking about it, but it's so slow. Like creating change in these systems is so slow. And so, but I feel like there's I don't know if you are aware, but there's so many, like you mentioned earlier, Rosalind, there's so much research happening now around natural assets, and it's in the news a lot more. Like Globe and Mail did an article on it. Well, they've done many articles on it. And I think that when we're seeing these extreme weather events and we're looking at how natural assets can mitigate and adapt to all this, that is, I think that's being heard by groups like the Public Sector Accounting Board and I have people from like different ministries across Canada reaching out to learn more about this now, which is shocking to me that well, kind of that it's taken this long, but also just to have, like Gibson's is, we're not even 5,000 people. We're like 4,700 people. We're 4 square kilometers. We're this tiny little place. And I think that it's getting picked up on, and it's becoming more and more mainstream. So I think that's like the best way to get to elicit change, is to have this out there and have more people talking about it.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
Tracy, I feel like you want to say something.
Yeah, so I've attended some webinars similar to this with Climate Caucus. Yeah, so I following on from Kath, and then I have another question entirely. Do you know if Climate Caucus is working on getting PSAB, like getting the various councils all across Canada to have their councils, have letters of endorsement or a push?
Yeah, I'm not sure what, because I know Climate Caucus, they've done some work on natural asset management. They've built a document recently, I believe. Yeah. But I don't know. I'm not sure. And this is the interesting thing, because I'm a staff member, so I'm not an elected official. And I try to make sure that I inform my council as best I can about the work we're doing, but there's so much, like, it's just the lack of staff capacity to make sure that we're reporting out. And frustratingly, I find that the work that we're doing maybe reaches more of a national audience than a local. And so, right, because it's groups like yourselves that reach out to us, or, and council are inundated with what they have to do on their day to day. And so, yeah, I think the Climate Caucus, that's a great group. That's a great group to get some movement on this. I'm just not sure what they're currently doing.
Right. I'm just thinking of, and I'm only an ally with Climate Caucus. I'm not an elected official. Maybe I can approach them and just kind of say there's, we need to get PS. And I don't know the exact acronym, but
PSAB,
just
yeah.
say they're not currently accepting natural assets in financial reporting. Is this something Climate Caucus is interested in kind of pushing along? So that was one question. But then the other question is about actual green infrastructure itself. So culverts, here in Kelowna, strangely enough, it's been on my, I was actually wanting to literally send an email today to our staff and ask, where are we at with green infrastructure? Because an initiative came before council literally about culverts. But this was, I think, we're 2013 now. It has to have been perhaps either at the very, very beginning of 2022, or it was in 2021. Just wondering, what's the extent of the culverts that you have in regards to grey infrastructure?
Yeah, I always love hearing what other municipalities are doing in that regard, because really I'm so focused on what we're doing here. So to hear other examples, we have down in, there's a couple things. So that White Tower Ponds system that I talked about earlier, which are these biomimicry or just enhanced natural assets, we're actually building an additional pond to create more capacity for stormwater for additional development that's going to happen upstream. So we don't inundate our creek systems. But that, I'm not sure if you're aware about this, but when we proposed doing this pond, the valuation of to do it as a culvert, send it just down like down the main road and headed out to the ocean was going to be a $4 million price tag. And then to build the pond is $1 million. And we got grant funding to do it of $955,000 from the provincial and federal government. So, yeah, I mean, the Gibsons is quite progressive that way, where we're not looking at putting in more culverts. And then those that we do have, we are proposing to, because we have 2 creeks that go through Lower Gibson, so this fairly large residential area. And we're going to, the culverts only are located underneath our roads, right? So our ditches, we have open ditches everywhere. We don't have culverted ditches. And they were, corrugated metal, whatever, and they're all failing or, at the point where they need to, this is like cost of replacement, right?
Yeah.
And so, so we're going to replace them all with concrete box culverts. So they're like open bottom. So they're fish friendly culverts. And they are going to be oversized so that we don't have to worry with like choke points and risk of flooding. Tracy, I saw your eyes go wide when I said concrete box culverts.
Yeah, I could never play poker. I could never play poker. And really, I could never be in politics. So.
Tracy and I are friends here in Kelowna. We work on a lot of the same issues, and we're actually on a committee of the city of Kelowna that's looking at climate adaptation. Right. So I think, Michelle, just the work that you're doing is so important. And I know that you probably think a lot about the challenges and barriers and keeping council informed and trying to convene everybody together on this. I think it's just a huge accomplishment. But I do want to say that what you're doing is you're showing that it's workable, right? You're showing, look, this is not really that difficult.
It's not.
It's something every community can do, and it could save money. Like instead of doing things the old way, like instead of doing things in this traditional way, recognize that traditional way is not working, and that we can actually do better. And that's the story that you're bringing in. I think that's important.
I was in a workshop last week, and there were 10 municipalities from the Lower Mainland represented at that workshop. And it was all about climate adaptation. And they said they had like little online surveys for us to fill in, like little polls, and then, it populates a graph and whatever. And one of the questions was, do you have a dedicated staff person working on climate resiliency? And the poll came up, and there were 2 of them that said yes. And then I realized that I was one of them. And then I texted my the director of infrastructure from here, who was in the webinar too. And I texted him and I said, did you just answer yes? And he said, yeah. And so I unmuted and I said, just so you know, the results are skewed. There's actually only one of us, only one municipality out of 10 that has a dedicated staff person. And everybody's trying to do it off the side of their desks. And and it's so, like I said at the beginning, when this role began, it was a 6-month term thing, right? And is it viable to have somebody, because what had happened was we had an asset management coordinator. So asset management, we've got a fairly robust asset management system, and so when we look at replacement of these assets and monitoring these assets and yada yada, and then the position was vacant for a while. And so council and the directors and the CAO said, what if we look at natural asset management and try to fill a role that way? Because it's still asset management. It's just looking at like all of it. And so and so now they've gotten rid of the asset management position. And so it's just me. But going back to what you said, Rosalind, it's true. I'm one person. in this
Yeah.
organization. And but what it requires is that you just coordinate. You just collaborate with outside groups, outside entities, you collaborate with consultants, you get grants, you know, you just
Yeah.
get it done.
Yeah.
It's actually, and you know, for me, it's simple because this is embedded in every single department and all of the operations within the town of Gibson. So
Yeah.
like I said, I work with the director of finance closely, and I work with planning, and I work with public works and parks, because it's all connected.
Mhm.
So
Absolutely.
it makes sense.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
If I can add, the reason why, and I don't know if I misspoke, I don't know what I just said, the alternative to colours was bioswales. So it was bioswales that
Right.
got, yeah.
Yeah. So, and we have, I mean,
but the way we got that was because sustainability staff hired a student, and they hired the student for a set amount of time to look at, you know, like, I guess, green, maybe just environmental options, sustainability options. I can't remember how it was worded.
Yeah.
The student looked at things, and this was one of the proposals.
Yeah.
And I hope I'm not overstepping here, but well, I won't name the corporation or the group. Another organization here in Kelowna have hired a university student to get, you know, without seeming to get in options for climate action and sustainability. So I'm just finding that it's not necessarily a long-term solution, but it's a way of getting cheap labor to put forward sustainability issues without
having staff do it.
You know, it's like, oh, well, this is what the student employee came up with, and this is a reasonable cost, and blah blah blah. It's interesting how, you know, students now, and it just shows why the education options that are out there in colleges and universities, this is why it's important, because, you know, you're bringing in the students with this fresh knowledge, and then sometimes the student position can become a permanent position. And you've moved the needle.
I every chance I get when I'm in a meeting with somebody from any ministry within the province, or these groups, like, I don't know if you've heard of the LGCAP, which is the local government's climate adaptation plan or something, right, through BC. They every time I meet with them and we talk about like staff capacity, and I say, you're providing us with $74,000 a year for the next 3 years or whatever. Can we use it for staff? Not to do a study, not to do a project, but to hire a dedicated staff person, and then have that be dedicated funding in perpetuity. Because I mean, you can't just, like, for me, I can do all the studies I want, right? Because there's so much interest. It's called, like, Gibson's is the living lab. So we have so many groups that want to do work here and use Gibson's as an example. Great. But who's going to implement those projects in the end? Who's going to, studies are fine, but I mean, we need to move towards action. And going back to your point about bioswales, I would argue too that some of the, like, green infrastructure is great, but only if it works. And so there's like, for Gibson specifically, I don't know about Kelowna, because I don't really understand the geology of the site, but here in Gibson's, if we were to put in a bioswale, first, luckily we have this information, but we would need to do like soil analysis. We would need to do infiltration studies to see the permeability of the soil, because there's a there's a development that went in years ago, and they did bioswales, like what they call vegetated bioswales, but they're typically just grass. But the infiltration capacity of the soil in that area of Gibson's is extremely low. So what you end up with is just water just sitting and just pooling. And so,
Right.
you know, when we talk about stormwater ponds and green infrastructure, as far as like ways to manage that runoff, you need to locate them in areas that can handle that water and that can infiltrate. Because like for me, the whole purpose is to make sure that we're protecting the aquifer, so that when there's aquifer recharge and we know where these recharge areas are, that we direct water to those. So we direct our creek water to those, that we're not like diverting it so it's not infiltrating, right? And so Emmanuel and I, we always say to each other, like, is the water in the right place? Like anytime we look at something, you know, changing something or a development or looking at a creek, we say, you know, and then you start like picturing like a big eraser and erase everything that's in the town, and then just look at the geology and the topography of the town and say, is the water in the right place? We're diverting it through, you know, through stormwater culverts on the edges of roads to a certain area. And then we've got like this full-on drought happening in the summer, and our creek is dry, but there's constant water coming out of these culverts down into the ocean. And you think, well, why is that happening? Why is that not being directed to the creeks to sustain fish habitat? And so, yeah.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and for the great rich knowledge that you're bringing to this discussion, because I definitely learned something new that I really didn't know. I thought I knew something about it, and I really definitely learned quite a lot. So before we log off, I just wanted to raise, we've got our next speaker coming on March 21st, and we have a very amazing guest, Zoe Craig Sparrow from Justice for Girls. So she's the director at Justice for Girls, and this is a nonprofit organization that promotes social, economic, and environmental justice with a mission to end poverty, violence, and racism. So that's on March 21st. And then on April 17th, we have MJ Torres, who's a coordinator for World Wildlife Fund. So she's going to be talking about the role of youth in biodiversity. So we're very excited about that. Some of you may know that the Government of Canada, particularly Employment and Social Development Canada, has started its voluntary national review process. And if you're new to the SDGs, you might know that Canada has obligations under the SDGs. And one of those obligations is to do a voluntary national review of where we are, how well are we doing on different SDGs. So they have to report that, and they're starting that process. They're looking for public input until March 10th. So I'll put the link in the chat, but just to let you know, for this national review, they're looking at, they want you to know about any projects or initiatives that they should highlight. They're looking at challenges and goals in implementing, challenges and opportunities in implementing the SDGs, and also opportunities to raise awareness. And there are some specific SDGs that they focus on every year. So I'll just put that in the chat, and it's the, this is where you can find out more information about the public input, and also talk to your organization and see if your organization has made a submission, because it's based on organization submissions. Let me just, oh, here we go. Nope.
Whether Michelle can respond to that and mention the funding.
Yeah, funding, full-time funding for resilience positions. Yes, absolutely.
Well, I was thinking for the green infrastructure itself, you know, the fact that you can't use the green infrastructure side of things as asset
Mm.
financially. Not wording this well.
Yeah, just making those specific changes can make a huge difference, right? So that could be something that could even be discussed in this consultation. We also have SDG Week is upcoming in March, March 6th to 10th, 2023. There'll be tons of activities, workshops, and panels and programming on university and colleges campuses. And on March 29th, there's a worldwide teach-in on climate. And this is going to be an event for colleges, universities, high schools, K to 12, K to 8, faith communities in more than 50 countries are going to be organizing events all across the world on climate awareness. Thank you so much to, I know we were a small group today, but I know that probably more people will follow on and want to see the recording and to learn from this and just this really important information about what's going on in Gibsons. So thank you so much, Michelle, and to all of our guests here today. And I think that's it from me, unless Cass or Jade have anything else to add from RCEN.
I think we're good for now, right, Jade?
Yeah, I'm good. Just thank you again to Michelle. I really enjoyed that presentation. It was very informative. I've got notes and I'm just thinking now about, how I could now plug that information into other conversations. And yeah, no, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So I'll be following up with an email, and I like to include resources on the subject. So I'll be sharing that with our caucus members as well.